Thank you so much for having me here today. It's wonderful to be here and to speak with you about these stories that just mean so much to me. So this is a presentation version of a real walking tour that you can take yourself with our free app that you can get on Android or on Apple. But this format lets you take the walking tour and stay warm and dry. So I'm going to introduce myself in just a moment, but first I just want to situate us. As John said, Vancouver is situated on the traditional, mostly unceded land of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Kakite First Nations. The areas that are demarcated on the map are the locations of the current nations, but of course through history, these communities have taken broad territories, sometimes overlapping with complicated trade networks and complicated economies. And these nations are, of course, still here today. And I wanted to talk for a moment about what we mean when we say it's unceded land. It's important to me that we just spend a moment on that. So starting in 1701, the British Crown started brokering treaties with Indigenous nations in what we call Canada. And the Douglas Treaties were signed between 1850 and 1852. You can see them down at that lower tip of Vancouver Island. That's what provided the basis for the Hudson's Bay Company to buy up large portions of southern Vancouver Island. The numbered treaties were negotiated and signed between 1881 and 1921, but only Treaty 8 extends into British Columbia. These treaties are incredibly controversial. Many lectures could be spent on them, but what I want to draw attention to today is the fact that most of BC is not covered by treaties at all, and was not covered by treaties throughout most of the history of BC. The colony of British Columbia was unable to negotiate many treaties, but claimed the land and distributed it to settlers nonetheless. Treaty 8 was the last treaty signed in this territory until the Nisga'a Treaty, which was enacted in 2000 and started the current era of modern treaties. So this is important context in the discussion that's going to follow, because we're going to be talking about women's labor history in Vancouver. And an uncomfortable part of that is that we're often talking about people who fought for their own rights while ignoring or even fighting against the rights of others. And this is context that's important to recognize. And just as the labor movement has not always seen women's rights as integral, although it does now, these movements have not always included racialized peoples, people of various gender and sexual expressions, people with disabilities, and other marginalized peoples, which of course these peoples have always been part of their communities. So at the BC Labour Heritage Centre, we really strive to raise these voices in the historical record. And I hope I will contribute to that effort with some of the stories that you'll hear today. So I'm your tour guide today. I'm Natasha, and I'm the project manager, as you heard. At the BC Labour Heritage Centre, our mission is to preserve, document, and present the rich history of working people and their unions in British Columbia. We draw on written histories, archived media, and our own oral history collection to present and contextualize these stories. Due to the nature of record keeping, it's often the histories of the owning class, the corporations, and even the histories of buildings that are most represented. But work and workers have shaped social policy in ways great and small. And as a sociologist, I would be remiss if I didn't say that, we often hear that society tells us this and society tells us that, but we have to remember that we are society. So we build our world as our world builds us. This is a two-way process, a two-way relationship, as it always has been. And so labor history is full of stories of working class people taking action to build a society according to their ideals. That's indeed the function of most social movements, is to try to build a society according to what that social movement believes is the society that they want. So we're going to hear about labor history today. But this is a walking tour, believe it or not. So let's see where we are. Here's a map to help us establish our location. We are right in downtown Vancouver. We're going to start at stop 1, and these are a collection of physical locations all within a few blocks. You could walk and do this tour, although it would take you a little bit longer to physically do it than it's going to take us here today. Let's head right on over to stop 1 and we'll get started. Bonjour, hello. We're here at Cathedral Square, named after the Holy Rosary Cathedral, which it faces. Constructed for Expo 86, this park became part of a collaborative art project called Blanketing the City in 2021. Coast Salish master weavers from the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations designed the patterns we see painted on the concrete cylinders around the park. So I've had a haircut since then, but you know it's me because of the shirt. So here's a photo that better shows those beautiful patterns on the cylinders. I'm a fiber artist myself. I knit and crochet and spin and weave, and I just think these patterns are absolutely, they're marvelous. These are patterns like you would see in traditional weaving, but here they are mural sized, making them momentous. I just love this piece so much. And this location gives us a spot to talk about Indigenous women's labor. So of course, long before Europeans ever set foot here, Indigenous tribes have been fishing these waterways, processing the catch, and operating complex trading industries with other nations, including there are trails that lead fish processing industry from the BC coast through to the Alberta plains. Like, these were complicated and wide-ranging trade networks. When European settlers came here, they learned seine fishing, seine net fishing, from Indigenous fishers. But it was not until the invention of food canning that fishing was scaled up to be a major industry. So the first salmon cannery in British Columbia started operating in 1867 on the Fraser River near New Westminster. But by the Second World War, over 200 canneries were found along the British Columbia coast. I believe today there's one specialized cannery on the island somewhere, maybe Nanaimo. These canneries were incredible places. They were set up in long, sort of a assembly line style fashion with knives and chopping machines and tubs and complicated processes. And the majority of the workers in these canneries were women, and the majority of the women were Indigenous, although there were also Chinese, Japanese, and European women working in these canneries. They cleaned, they prepared the fish. A fish came in at one end and a can came out, or a crate full of cans came out at the other end. This was difficult work, but it was also desirable work. The women in the canneries were culturally and linguistically very diverse, but they found common cause as workers. They translated for each other, they communicated with workers in other canneries, and together they were able to collectively bargain things like piece rates and some working conditions. We're so fortunate to have an oral history collection collected in 1978 by Sarah Diamond, and one of the interviews in this collection is Josephine Charlie. She was a member of the Squamish Nation. She was born in 1898, and she worked in the fish canneries for many years. Here, in her voice, she describes what working in the canneries was like in the 1920s and 30s.
Oh, we'd work from 7 to sometimes midnight. Oh, we'd work, and the woman on the line worked till 1 o'clock as the line's going, you know, and the ones cooking would be there till 2 or 3 in the morning, and we'd work all hours from then on. That's the sockeye season, and then the pinks come in. That's where we pretty die. They come by the thousands. Sometimes one sailboat would get 20,000, 30,000. You could see them come around the pond just like if they were swaying, you know. They're so full of fish. Oh, we're all grown.
Josephine Charlie was active in the Native Sisterhood of BC, and she later became a steward in the United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union. Women, like I said, worked together in these locations, but facilities were often racially segregated. At the Namu fish cannery, signs divided the facilities between whites and natives, and the signs had been there for years. And the unions had made many demands for these signs to come down. The United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union and the Native Brotherhood of BC had demanded that these signs be removed, but management took no action. So one summer, 1954, the workers did. They held a joint meeting of all of the Indigenous and non-Indigenous workers. There were 154 members, and they voted unanimously to do away the signs. And then they went and they took them down. They took the signs down themselves. They ended the segregation. It was a small step, and this was a long road to overcome racism and ethnic divisions in BC's fishing industry, but it was an important step. Also that summer, so this picture here that we have, the boat in this image is the Texada, which is a fish packer run by BC Packers, and it would travel between Namu and Bella Coola. And women would often leave their home communities for the season to go work in the cannery for the fish season. Well, there was a tenderman strike, a UFAW tenderman strike this summer. And so the women were going to be stranded at the cannery in Namu with no work to do and no way to get home. So BC Packers got an agreement from the striking workers that they would run a special trip to get the women home. And the women brought with them these signs because they were not going back up again. So this sign is actually in the David York collection held at Simon Fraser University. All right, right next door is the Labour Temple. The Labour Temple was built by and for trade unionists, opening in 1913. The building included meeting halls, a billiards room, a low-cost cooperative store, and offices. It was the physical heart of labor in Vancouver until it was sold to the provincial government in 1921. The building served many purposes through the years, including as a technical school, and the original facade was covered up. A more recent renovation uncovered the original hand-carved sign you see above me today. The building is now home to a variety of businesses and a couple of union locals. So we're often asked about the spelling in the stonework, that it's L-A-B-O-R without the U, which the U is characteristic of Canadian spelling, and without the U we typically think of it as American spelling. And if you were eagle-eyed, you might have even noticed that in my captions I wrote it wrong because my brain cannot spell labor without the U. There's no labor without you. Oh, that's right. I should have had that joke. At the time the Labour Temple was built, actually both spellings were accepted. And so there's some suggestion possibly that this spelling was chosen because of the close ties between the Canadian labor movement and the American labor movement. We don't know for sure. We know that both spellings were accepted at the time. The Labour Temple was the site of a violent riot that nearly turned fatal in 1918. So you may have heard the story of Ginger Goodwin before, you may not have. Ginger Goodwin was a trade unionist and a socialist, and he had previously been deemed ineligible for military service due to poor health. Some records say he had black lung, some records say he only had one lung. Either way, he was not the sort of fellow you would think you'd send away to war. After he organized miners in Trail, however, it was determined that he was in fact fit for duty, and he was sent to be conscripted. But he refused. He fled to Cumberland, and he hid in the woods for months until July 27th, 1918, when he was shot and killed by Special Constable Dan Campbell. Now, this was momentous. Ginger Goodwin was beloved. He was already an icon in the labor movement. And so his killing galvanized the labor movement into having a 24-hour general strike on the day of his funeral. So it's August 2nd, 1918, and tempers are hot. The labor movement was protesting Ginger Goodwin's killing, but also the war itself, conscription, and the looming unemployment crisis that was right on the horizon, 1918. Meanwhile, veterans who had already returned from the war saw Goodwin as a draft dodger and a Bolshevik. And through all this, business association propaganda was painting the entire labor movement as anti-patriotic and encouraging those returned veterans to oppose the strike. So all this is in the air. So as thousands of people on Vancouver Island were walking the funeral procession, striking workers were gathering at the Labour Temple in Vancouver in solidarity, and about 300 returned war veterans stormed the Labour Temple. They threw books, they threw equipment out of upper floor windows, and they cornered the head of the Labour Council, Victor Midgley, to throw him out the window too. The temple's switchboard operator, Frances Foxcroft, stepped in and saved him. Alone, she put herself between Midgley, who had been badly beaten, and the rioting veterans, physically blocking them from pushing him off the ledge. For her efforts, the business agents and officers presented Frances with an amethyst and pearl pendant. Frances Foxcroft told them, "I would have done the same thing for any of them in similar circumstances." Just a formidable woman. There's Ginger. We unfortunately don't know much about Frances Foxcroft, but we do know that she was a union member. She belonged to the Telephone Operators Union, which was one of the very few unions to have women members at the time. All right, let's head on over to Victory Square. The Victory Square Cenotaph was built in 1924 to commemorate the lives lost by Canadian soldiers in the First World War. Every November 11th, war veterans and others gather to remember the fallen. In more recent years, the contributions of Canada's nursing sisters from both the First and Second World Wars have also been recognized. We don't know exactly when this photo was taken, but we know it was shortly after the cenotaph was built, so likely 1924-25 or thereabouts. And here at Victory Square, we're going to stop and talk about women's labor in the Second World War. So women were not permitted to serve combat duty in World War II, but their labor was absolutely essential to the war effort, paid and unpaid labor. In terms of paid labor, this was a seismic change in women's opportunities because women were called to work in munitions factories, shipyards, and other non-traditional jobs, which just is so impossible to overstate what a change that had in their lives and in the culture. And while they were finding their place in the workforce, many of these women were also becoming active in trade unions, including about 1,000 women who worked at the North Vancouver shipyards. Johnny Rankin was born in 1916, and she worked as a riveter during the Second World War. So in this excerpt from her 1978 oral history interview with Sarah Diamond, she talks about what it was like to work with men and what working outside the home for pay meant to women's lives.
We were very much accepted after they got used to the idea, and they liked to work with women, and everybody learned something. It was an education, and mostly women. They learned to, see, most women were so dependent all their life on a man's salary. It was a tremendous thing to earn your own money.
Yep.
And a lot of marriages, some broke up over it because she wasn't going to go back and ask anymore. Another one, a lot of them were better because the man understood her more as a partner. I worked in the deep tanks when I was a riveter, and I was slimy. You know, I used to hang off the back of the speaker. I wouldn't even let me sit down on it. And say, I can't understand why you like to do this. And they couldn't understand. Besides getting the money, we were sort of buying back our self-respect.
Yeah.
And that's something none of those men really understood. And I don't think they understand it today.
And so, of course, those jobs were not available to everyone, but we can hear from what Johnny says just how meaningful and how important those jobs were to the women who were able to get them. We are going to look across the street and we can see the Hamilton Block, and that's next. Today, this brick building at Pender and Hamilton is a designated heritage site with office and retail rentals. In the city's early years, garment workers, mostly immigrant women from Europe, toiled long hours within the brick walls. Some garment workers in the city organized into the Journeyman Tailors Union as early as 1893. The sign, Papa's Furs, with an entrance at 449 Hamilton Street, is the only reminder of a small family business manufacturing and selling luxury furs on this block. One of the organizers of the Journeyman Tailors Union was Helena Gutteridge, who was the first woman on Vancouver City Council. Universal Knitting opened in Vancouver in 1914. It produced sweaters, coats, and swimwear, and it was proudly British Columbian. If you look up Universal Knitting ads throughout the history of this company, it was proudly British Columbian. That was on all of the ads. For many years, it shared this building, this Hamilton building, with the Vancouver Daily Star. The newspaper occupied the bottom 2 floors, and the knitting mill occupied the top 2. Women sat in long rows, assigned work as machine operators and finishers, while men had jobs like knitters and supervisors, which has some comparisons to the cannery work as well. The work that the women did was typically sitting down in one place doing repetitive motions, and the work that the men did were typically more physical jobs and supervisory jobs. In 1924, the company got the right to produce swimwear for Janssen, and they soon found these facilities inadequate. Business was booming with Janssen. So the 2 sections of the company reincorporated under just the Janssen name and moved to a new purpose-built facility at 196 Kingsway. In 1935, halfway through the Depression era, employees organized into a union at Janssen. So this building might be familiar to some. It stayed in business looking much like this into 1997, which is when Janssen closed the factory. The company is still in business, but they no longer have this factory. We're going to keep talking about Vancouver's garment industry with our next stop. What Janssen was to swimwear, Marjorie Hamilton was to ladies' wear. The factory operated at several locations through the years, but for many years it was here, at 318, now 320, West Cordova. So Marjorie Hamilton, again, this might be a familiar brand or a familiar site for folks who know this area. Marjorie Hamilton was another one of these big success stories. Now, Vancouver's not really well known for having a garment industry. There were these few standouts, though. In 1944, Marjorie Hamilton was in Vancouver, and she was a young wife to a Royal Canadian Air Force sergeant who was away at war. It wasn't possible to buy things like glamorous lingerie during wartime, so Marjorie started making them out of fabric remnants, selling them to friends and neighbors. When her husband returned from war, the 2 of them committed to developing this business, and they became one of those big post-war success stories. By 1949, they had 35 employees operating electric machines. 1949. They moved away from lingerie and focused on dresses, many of which you can find today in vintage clothing collections and for sale online. I've done my share of browsing. There's still lots of them out there. And Marjorie Hamilton was a pioneer in the leisure wear category, spreading the West Coast casual lifestyle through Canada and internationally. But what was it like for the workers at these factories, Marjorie Hamilton's and the other garment factories in Vancouver? Well, until the 1960s, as I mentioned, most garment workers were European women. But from the 60s until today, they're predominantly Asian women. Like many manufacturing industries, garment factories typically employed new immigrants and other vulnerable workers who might not have the Canadian language and legal knowledge to be able to advocate for their rights. And then fear tactics would be used to prevent them from organizing. Some exploitative sweatshop owners pay employees under the table, dodge taxes. In 1985, the province reported on sweatshop conditions at a number of Vancouver garment factories. Complaints varied from wage theft to verbal and physical abuse. The Chinese Benevolent Association launched an investigation saying that Chinese women in particular were singled out for abuse at work, but were too afraid of retaliation to make those claims public. The staff of Marjorie Hamilton at the time, in 1985, was around 200, 95% of whom were Chinese. If you don't think that 1985 is history, it is. My children like to remind me that I was born in the 1900s, which makes them feel really good. But this is our garment history in Vancouver. So the International Ladies Garment Workers Union agreed that Marjorie Hamilton was one of the better shops, but it was still reported to the BC Human Rights Council for age discrimination. In a few instances, the factory had laid off a number of older workers while advertising in Chinese language newspapers to hire more workers in. They were found liable in several of the cases and they were forced to pay a fine. Also in 1985, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union launched an organizing drive at Marjorie Hamilton. It was a complicated, multi-year struggle. They did finally succeed in organizing and negotiating a first contract, and when they held the meeting to ratify that contract, the vote was ratified by all 4 members who attended to vote. The union agent said, quote, "Turnout did not reflect the support for the union's position and contract, but rather shows the fear of new union members who don't want to antagonize their employer." Today, most garment workers in Canada are not unionized, and little remains of a garment industry in Vancouver. Reportedly, at-home sewing for piecework rates is quite widespread, but because of the nature of that work, it is exceedingly hard to track and to organize. So now let's head back to Victory Square, and we're going to talk about a bank that used to be just across the street. In 1950, a branch of the Bank of Commerce was built on the north corner of the Hamilton block, with an entrance on Hastings Street. 65 years later, it was demolished to make way for a film school. Known as the Victory Square branch, the Commerce Bank was the scene of a historic union drive in 1976. So bank tellers and floor-level staff at this time were predominantly women. And due to a legal loophole having to do with the fact that banks are federally regulated, bank management was allowed to assign compulsory unpaid overtime to the staff, and there was very little that the staff could do. The Service, Office and Retail Workers Union of Canada, SORWAC, wanted to change that, and conveniently they had an office right across the street at the Dominion building, which is still there. So we've talked about our oral history project. One of the people who we interviewed for the oral history project worked at this bank and was involved in this drive. So we're going to hear the story in her words.
The Service, Office and Retail Workers Union, SORWAC, was small, grassroots, and overtly feminist. It specifically sought to organize women in occupations that were typically ignored by the established unions. Jackie Ainsworth had been working at the CIBC Victory Square branch for about 3 weeks when she learned that her colleagues were looking to take action against the unpaid overtime and favoritism they were subjected to.
And then, of course, I raised that I thought we should join a union. And everybody said, oh, yes, that's probably a good idea, but that's impossible. That's just ridiculous in terms of, you know, how big CIBC is. And that was just a fantasy. And so I got home and called up Jean and Melody, and we met and we did up a leaflet saying why bank workers should be in a union, and they leafleted my branch the next morning. And just so it wouldn't look super conspicuous, they leafleted several branches on West Hastings there. A couple women in my branch really got interested in the idea. And so they started coming to SORWAC meetings. And again, we talked about the whole thing about, you know, did SORWAC have the resources to take on the banking industry? And we were convinced that in order to organize an industry the size of the banking industry, that we needed to have new organizing strategies. You know, we talked to so many union reps, whether it was in office and technical employees or in hotel and restaurant or in retail clerks, and they just didn't understand our issues. We just felt that it needed to be a whole new kind of union and a whole new kind of union organizing.
In 1977, the Canadian Labour Relations Board made a landmark ruling. Bank workers could organize branch by branch, rather than requiring employees all across the country to sign up together. This was a major win for SORWAC.
Previous to that, bank workers didn't think they had the right to unionize. I mean, we were told by management we didn't have the right to unionize because of how important the banking industry is. So we were told we couldn't unionize. So in that way, it was a really important decision.
So it was a bit of a Pyrrhic victory, unfortunately. Even before the ruling came down, SORWAC knew that they didn't have the resources or the momentum to go against the Canadian banking industry if the banks wanted to fight. And of course the banks wanted to fight. But from 1972 to 1986, Sorwak organized bank workers, restaurant workers, childcare workers, and more. They trained a generation of women union leaders, and they showed that you didn't have to be a big international organization to make a mark. In 1986, they disbanded, and many of their members merged into other unions. But that bank-by-bank ruling was huge. And so whenever you hear of a location of a Starbucks or a McDonald's or an Amazon warehouse, one location unionizing, joining a union, you're seeing something that's only possible because of the David and Goliath fight that little feminist union won. Let's head on over to our next stop. The Sun Tower was built in 1912 by the owner of the Vancouver World newspaper. The building was originally called the World Tower. In 1937, the Vancouver Sun newspaper bought the property and changed the name to the Sun Tower, a name that remains to this day, despite the newspaper moving its operation to South Granville Street in 1964 and later to Granville Square. So here we see the construction of the tower. It used to be the tallest building around. Now there are taller towers, but the Sun Tower is still absolutely iconic of the downtown Vancouver cityscape. Most journalists at the time were men, but there were women making their mark in the journalism industry early on. Doris Milligan was a journalist with the Vancouver Sun for several years, starting in the 1930s, and she was also a key local organizer for the American-based Newspaper Guild. Mamie Maloney Boggs, a Sun columnist, and also the best 1940s name. She was also a guild organizer. By the early 1940s, Doris, Mamie, and other guild organizers had succeeded in signing the majority of the employees into the union. Years later, Doris was interviewed about this drive, and she said, "I know we used to have meetings at nighttime and sometimes in people's homes. We paid for our own meals. We never got any honorariums or anything. We just worked our heads off for the union. It was very much needed." Sun employees are still in a union despite ongoing upheavals in the newspaper industry, and today these journalists are represented by Unifor Local 2000. The White Lunch at 65 East Hastings Street, now long gone, opened in 1913. It was one of 4 White Lunch cafes in the city, famous for its neon signs and affordable food. The restaurant chain reflected a city divided by racism, as its very name, White Lunch, suggests. Only white people were hired, and only white people were served. The all-white concept was very popular at the time when specifically anti-Chinese and anti-Japanese sentiment was high. In 1918, an incident occurred that made international news. Some Japanese officials representing a steamship company that were coming to do business on behalf of the steamship company, they were denied service at the White Lunch on Hastings Street. The waiter saying that, no, we only serve white people. This became a major embarrassment, and the general manager was forced to clarify that the waiter was untrained, he was saying the wrong information. Of course, people of all colors could buy food at the White Lunch. They just couldn't eat inside. So this was controversial in the public, even in 1918. There were letters to the editor in subsequent days defending the businessmen and calling for the White Lunch to have its business license revoked. The restaurant changed over time. We don't know when it became fully integrated, but we do know that it changed over time. And most people who grew up in Vancouver today remember it as being a multicultural place. It was the site in 1937 of the Hotel and Restaurant Employees Union organizing the staff, who were mostly women, into a union, despite strong management opposition. An employee was fired for her union activity, and so the staff at all 4 locations went on strike. They believed that they would have widespread support for this strike because the White Lunch was a working class sort of place, and they thought working class people would understand the need for unions and would respect the strike. And they were right. Many customers refused to cross the picket line, and the strike was won just a couple of weeks later. The union won recognition, they established the legal right to picket, and the employees who had been fired for their union activity were reinstated. It continued to be an uphill climb, however, though. The company used lots of union-busting tactics. They joined with other restaurants to start a company union run by managers, and they spoiled first contract negotiations. And 5 years later, the White Lunch was still on the "we do not patronize" list of the Trades and Labor Council. The iconic sign still hangs above the Army and Navy department store at 27 West Hastings Street, despite the century-old retail outlet closing its doors in 2020. In 1949, women employees took a historic stand here against their employer. So Army and Navy was started by Sam Cohen in 1919, and it became Canada's first discount department store. For 101 years, it was a family-run business and only shut its doors for good in 2020. If you grew up in or near Vancouver, you probably have memories of the shoe sale. In 1949, employees of the new Westminster branch of Army and Navy went on strike. Their union, the Retail, Wholesale and Department Store Employees Union, had won a conciliation board ruling against the store, but the store refused to implement it. So the workers, again mostly women, went on strike for improved wages and better union security. Staff at other locations picketed to support their fellow employees, but 6 months later the strike was still ongoing. The BC Labour Movement supported the strikers, individual unions raised money for them through levies, and City Council even stepped in at the union's request. But the battle was intractable. 16 months after the strike began, the union ended it unceremoniously. It remains one of the longest strikes in BC's history. I love this photo, just in case, I'm not sure how clear it is on the screen, but there is a person wearing a monkey suit, holding a sign that says, "I can live on peanuts, but Army and Navy employees can't." So good. Writing it down in the notebook for strategies. A later battle at Army and Navy had a happier outcome. So the Canadian Bill of Rights, passed in 1958, recognized the principle of gender equality, but definitely didn't mandate gender equity in pay. More than 20 years later, male employees at Army and Navy were receiving higher wages still for performing the same jobs in the same workplaces. So in 1980, women employees at the store who were not unionized launched an equal pay fight. The labor movement and women's groups joined in support, and they carried out sidewalk protests that shamed the employer into recognizing equal pay for equal work. It's a little bit of a walk to our last two stops. I hope your feet aren't too sore yet, but it's worth it, so we're going to head on over to Chinatown. The Yik Fung Tea House operated on the second floor of this building at 137 East Pender. It was one of 6 tea houses in Chinatown during the interwar years. Each tea house had 4 or 5 female employees who worked long hours, sometimes 7 days a week. So the first Chinese settlers to BC came as early as 1858, but there were very few women among them. Men came to work the Fraser River Gold Rush and later the CP Railway, but repressive laws meant to prevent permanent settlement made it extremely difficult for Chinese women to migrate. The head tax, of course, made it very expensive to migrate from China, and it made it unfeasible for people to come who couldn't then enter the labor force to pay back that cost. So if it was hard to bring a brother or a son over, it was almost impossible to bring a wife or a daughter over. But there was a loophole. For a time, the Canadian government allowed merchants to enter Canada for free and to bring their families with them. So for decades, the only Chinese women admitted to Canada were those who entered under this classification. Wealthy women who were merchants' wives and daughters, or women who were brought over illegally in disguise as merchants' wives and daughters. And these women were often brought over indentured. One way or another, Chinese women could only enter Canada dependent on men. All women's labor was integral to the economy. Women who entered under the merchant's exemption were not legally allowed to work, and there were all sorts of strategies to make sure that these women were actually married to the men they were entering with. Some people were forced to get married at immigration to prove that they were married. There were people out there looking to report if women were working. But women's labor has always been integral to the economy. In addition to the unpaid work they did at home, many also took in paid sewing, laundry, and other jobs. The labor movement at the time opposed Chinese businesses, made it even more difficult, and the labor movement at the time was active in promoting the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Yikfeng Tea Room is in this picture here. And so women who were brought over illegally under that exemption may have been sold into the sex trade or marriage, or indentured in low-status occupations like maids or tea house girls. While working in a restaurant could be respectable, working in a tea room was not respectable. Women who performed this work endured scorn and social exclusion. Denise Chong's family memoir, The Concubine's Children, tells the story of her grandmother, who was under contract like this to one such tea house. She had to work for 2 years to pay off the debt of her passage to Canada. She describes the work as closer to entertainment than food service, and says that it was precarious and it put women at high risk of exploitation. But of course, in typical fashion, Canadian laws and custom left very few legitimate pathways for Chinese success, and then blamed the Chinese community for the outcomes that came from this lack of legitimate pathways. Of course, as time went by, Canadian-born Chinese women started entering the labor force, and opportunities were still limited, but greater than those that had been available to their mothers. Most worked at Chinese-owned businesses as shop clerks or in food manufacturing, laundry, and garment making. Lillian Ho Wong was born in Vancouver's Chinatown in 1895, and she came of age during the Chinese Exclusion Act, where there was no migration allowed from China to Canada. She had very limited financial and social options, but a strong community that was building a Chinese-Canadian identity and community. So in this photo, we see Lillian working at a millinery shop around 1919. In 1934, we see the first record of a Chinese nurse at Vancouver General Hospital, but she was certainly exceptional. And the expansion of work options for Chinese women came slowly and unevenly. Vi's Chicken and Steakhouse operated in a building once standing at 209 Union Street. It was a go-to music joint run by Vi and Bob Moore for 31 years. Vi's restaurant was part of Hogan's Alley, an enclave of black residents within the Strathcona neighborhood, running from Park Lane to Jackson Avenue and between Union and Pryor. So Vi was born on Salt Spring Island. Her family had been early black pioneers to British Columbia. They were among a group of free black settlers who came from California to Canada to escape discriminatory Jim Crow laws. Some of them did say that the situation in Canada was not much better than what they had left. And so many ended up returning to the United States. Some did stay on Salt Spring Island, but the center of the black community grew up in the Strathcona neighborhood of Vancouver, right beside and actually somewhat integrated with the Chinatown. Hogan's Alley is the unofficial name of this neighborhood, and it had a reputation, of course, for great music, jazz, and cooking, as well as gambling and drinking. Vi and her husband ran Vi's Chicken and Steak, and it was the kind of place that only made a few things, but made them well. Chicken and steak and a few simple sides. Customers included jazz legends, music legends like Louis Armstrong, Cab Calloway, Duke Ellington, Nat King Cole, and Vi specifically made it a point to hire women. Nora Hendricks, Jimi Hendrix's grandmother, was a longtime cook there. Hogan's Alley itself was expropriated and demolished to make way for the Georgia Viaduct, which was completed in 1971. This was a part of a wave of urban renewal at the time, which was responsible for destroying Black, Chinese, and other racialized community sites all across Canada and the United States. Vi's, the actual location, was right on the edge of the demolition, and it survived that demolition and closed for good in 1979. In recent years, members of Vancouver's Black community have initiated projects to try to revive the history of Hogan's Alley, and with the redevelopment plans, which are delayed from what they were intended to be, but there have been some suggestions that Black community can be involved in the redevelopment of this area as the Georgia Viaduct is demolished. And that brings us to the end of the tour. I would like to thank some volunteers whose research contributed to this tour: Janet Nickel, Pam Moody, Joey Hartman, and Allison Jones. And I just want to talk for a moment about sort of some themes of this tour. Women's labor has always been essential in the economies of families, in the economies of nations. None of it could work without the labor of women. A lot of the labor of women and racialized people in BC has been outside of the organized labor movement for a few reasons. One, because these groups were not always welcome within the organized labor movement. Another, because the history of the organized labor movement is necessarily a history somewhat of industrialism. And industrial jobs were not open to women and were hedged off in terms of who could belong to them and who could then form and benefit from these unions. But also because the types of work that women and racialized people have had access to are not always kinds of work that are easy to unionize. Retail, food service, types of work that are, today we have the gig economy, right? Types of work that people move into and out of quickly, that are transient, that are sometimes done at home. These types of work are not always easy to unionize. And so a lot of this history is outside of the labor movement. But a lot of it is also within the labor movement. We know, and we saw some stories today, that the organized labor movement has been a powerful vehicle for women and racialized people to broadly advance social rights. Things like minimum wage, worker safety standards, pay equity, parental leave. These are all battles that were won by the labor movement on behalf of all workers, whether they're unionized or not. So I hope today that you heard some stories that were new to you, and I hope the next time that you look at the buildings around you and monuments around you, whether you're looking at big magnificent towers or humble little shacks, that you think about the working class people who built them, who worked and lived in them, and maybe who protested them, because that is all part of this drive to build a society. Thank you. I do have some walking tour booklets and some pamphlets where you can find those labor heritage moments that we were showing at the beginning. Those are all available online, and I've got some pamphlets here if you want to be able to find them.
At the end of the war, the women who'd been recruited into the war industries, and I'm assuming that some of them were unionized, were they dismissed once the soldiers had come home? And if so, did the labor union ever stand up for them?
That's a great question. I'm not sure of the answer of that. Luckily, my boss is here. Donna, do you know?
I think it was generally agreed that when the men came home from the war, they got their jobs back and the women were returned home. But a lot of those women kept their connections with one another, and I think in many ways formed the basis of labor organizations in the 50s and 60s, because they'd seen, the Boilermakers represented most of the women in the shipyards, and the Machinists Union represented the women who worked in the aircraft factories. So they had some experience and gained some recognition of what unions could do for them as workers.
I can add one element to that during the war, the Second World War, there were 17,000 people working in shipyards in Vancouver. 17,000. That's enough to fill Rogers Arena. You imagine every seat is filled with a shipyard worker, and well over half of those were women. Now, at the end of the war, of course, they stopped building ships. And so many of these people were laid off for good. And of course, there's that shift back towards filling those jobs with the men who'd gone off to war. And in some cases, the unions fought to get the women out of the workforce so as to make space for the men in those jobs. So that's great. Another question.
Yeah, your oral history project sounds fascinating. In that project, did you encounter women who worked as domestics, as nannies, as house cleaners, as live-in maids?
We don't really have interviews with women from those fields. Most of the interviews that we have are largely from people who were active in their unions, and those fields have not typically been unionized. There's some of those that are very difficult to unionize. And of course, you know, the stories of people from lower classes, the stories of women, the stories of people who moved for work are very hard to capture. And then when folks were not connected to the labor movement, we don't have a lot of records from that either. But of course, that's another area of incredibly important women's work that, I mean, like I'm saying, is very unseen. Thank you.
One thing that in that manner of racism and so on that I found just especially interesting was the white waitresses protests in the late 1930s, coming out of the brilliantly named Women and Girls Protection Act of the early 1920s, which said that a woman could not work in a business owned by an Asian person, and particularly a Chinese person at that. And then when the actual enforcement of it was put over onto the chief of police, as I understand it. And for some reason in the late 1930s, they all of a sudden decided to shut down or to fire all of the white women who were, this was at the order of the chief of police, who were working in these Chinese restaurants, and they went and protested very, very loudly at Vancouver City Hall. So this kind of crosses over because Women and Girls came out of that Janet Smith episode where the Chinese cook was blamed for the death of the nanny Janet Smith. But maybe you could comment. There's this sort of a crossover into wage work in that.
That's absolutely. And the fact that those white women waitresses protested shows how much they valued their work. And they did not see themselves as being in danger working in these Asian-owned businesses. They saw their work as valued. They saw themselves as being part of an economy, and that, you know, harkens to what Johnny Rankin told us too about that you know, the self-respect of that. It was a paternalistic act to try to, you know, protect white women by limiting their options and limiting what they could do and get them out of the workforce. And even then, women protested, and they said, no, that's not what we want.